The following episode is about journalism. I know not everyone with a local podcast wants to be a reporter, but there are principles of journalism that I think are helpful no matter what kind of local podcast you want to make. So I hope you'll listen for ideas and techniques that you can apply to your local show. I'm Jason Norris, and this is episode 12 of Podcast Local from On The Go FM.
More so than ever, journalism's borders have been attacked. And they're changing, and we have a lot more access now to people just putting out whatever they want. And I don't want people to make a mistake if they see somebody blogging about something or that somebody's tweeting about something and thinking, oh, well, this is journalism too. Sometimes I might say, oh, yeah, it is. Other times I might say, no, clearly this is not. And here's why.
Local podcasts can be anything. A conversation with people doing interesting things in your community. A history podcast, how your community became what it is today. People on the street interviews about serious or silly issues of the day. A local podcast can be, literally, anything you want it to be. And that means, if you're so inclined, a local podcast can be an alternative source for news for and about your community. If that idea intrigues you, stick around for some practical and philosophical advice for doing journalism in your local podcast. Support for Podcast Local comes from Satchel, the podcast player that supports local podcasters. Find out more at satchelplayer.com. By the way, I'll have a book recommendation at the end of this episode that is ideal for anyone wanting to do sound reporting. But first, let's hear from an expert in journalism. This is a guy who has studied journalism, reported the news, became a news director, and teaches students of journalism. Butler Kane is currently associate professor at the University of North Alabama and is chair of the Department of Communications. I met Butler back in 2002 when I went to work for Alabama Public Radio in Tuscaloosa. I worked on the air as a local host and behind the scenes in operations. Butler ran the newsroom. I remember him as being a laid-back, easygoing guy who was very good at delivering the news and running the newsroom. But I noticed something else about him when we reconnected on Skype recently and started talking about the subject of journalism. I discovered he has very strong convictions about the concept and implementation of journalism in all media, including local podcasting. And you'll hear that as we explore principles of journalism for local podcasters. One of the first things you want to do is to think about the kind of news reporting you want to do in your local podcast. Do you want to cover every fire, wreck, and scandal in town? What's that old cliche? If it bleeds, it leads?
Yeah, it's easy and it's formulaic. It doesn't require a lot of thought. And it doesn't require a lot of work either.
So, is there a better way?
I think one of the first places I would start would be for anyone who is thinking about doing a journalistic podcast, start by covering issues and stories that are not being covered by the local newspaper or the local media conglomerate or the local television station. Because if you're just covering that kind of stuff, it's already out there and already available, so why repeat that? I think part of the power of this type of podcast would be that you are covering things that other people are not covering, and there are going to be members of the audience who will search for that and who want that and will find that. And you've got to promote yourself, too. You got to let them know you're doing it. But I think there's a market there for that because, again, if you're already doing something everybody else is doing, who cares? So I think that would be the first thing. If you want to cover your community in a way that other people are not covering it, there will be an audience for that. I have long said that I would rather have an engaged and interested audience that may not be the largest audience, but they're paying attention to what you're doing and they're wanting to hear or read or listen to what you're doing. And so I think that kind of audience is really, really good. So I would start there.
Okay, now before we go on, pause for a moment and think. What are the issues not being covered by most media in your community? I'm not really talking about conspiracy theories. That's a completely different kind of podcast. What kinds of stories are usually covered by your local news outlets, and what stories do you wish you could hear more about? All right, now keep thinking about that as you listen to the rest of this episode. And if any issue or local government policy or anything like that comes to mind, the way you cover that needs to be different.
It's not just enough to talk about the issues. I think when you can have examples of how these issues are affecting people in their daily lives, that's powerful reporting. And we don't do it enough in quote unquote regular journalism because we don't have the time. We've only got 30 seconds or a minute, and we just can't possibly do all this because of the structure that we have with journalism. The great thing about podcasting is you don't have time constraints, really. You don't have to deal with that. You can make it as long or as short as you want. You can serialize it if you want. We saw a lot of great feedback over the last couple of years with podcasts that are done in serial formats. Particularly Serial has done really well. And so I think that's something that people who are doing journalistic podcasts could pay attention to as well. You don't have to try to cover that whole story at one time. In fact, I think that's one of the weaknesses of journalism is kind of the one and done that I would talk about in my newsroom a lot. Let's not be a one and done. This story can be looked at in multiple ways over a longer period of time. Let's try to do this. That's always a struggle. So I think if you are wanting to tell stories, consider that this story doesn't necessarily need to be told in one 10-minute chunk or whatever it might be. So it would be helpful to plan out. Maybe you end up planning to cover this story over multiple episodes over a couple of months. It would be nice to have a story arc that you kind of know what you're wanting to do. So that way you're not necessarily repeating yourself all the time and you're not doing things that ends up boring the audience. You're coming at this particular issue from a lot of different angles and a lot of different ideas. And so I think that keeps it fresh. Getting back to the point I was making earlier about having people in your stories, it's no longer good enough. This is a trap that day-to-day journalism gets into a lot, where you always have the expert or the talking head or those types of folks who talk about policy. All of that stuff is good, and there's a place for it, but we don't very often go to the people who are being affected by this policy or the people who are being affected by these changes. That's really where the story is. And so we need to do a better job of showing how John Q. and Jane Q. Public deal with whatever this political, economic, social situation is. I think that makes for better journalism that we're just not seeing on the local newscast, and we're not reading in the local newspapers. And so I think that's where podcasting, particularly from a journalistic standpoint, has a niche that they could do really, really well with.
But if your podcast is an audio-only podcast, you're facing a challenge that will require a lot of practice and effort to overcome. Ironically, that challenge comes from one of audio's most amazing qualities.
I still like the theater of the mind quality to audio, where you are hearing the people speak. You are hearing the sounds of the scene wherever you are, and you're seeing it in your mind's eye. That type of engagement, I believe, print and video can't replicate. You can imagine what these people look like. You can imagine what the scene looks like. Even if you're told what the scene looks like, everybody's going to imagine it a little bit differently. And I think that's really cool. That's a great aspect of audio. And also, it puts the onus on those who are writing audio journalism to be specific with their descriptions as well. So I think a lot of times audio forces you to be a better writer because you have to explain these things or describe these things so that when your audience member is envisioning that, they are envisioning as close to possible what that actual reality is. And you've got to be a good writer to be able to do that.
One way to become a better writer is, of course, practice. Write something every day. Another way to get better is by trying certain exercises that will help you in specific areas you're working to improve.
You know, I did an exercise with this with some of my students. I taught an audio journalism class at West Texas A&M. I had a class, maybe 12 students in there. And I said, hey, everybody, really quickly, I want you to, in your mind's eye, envision a red ball. Go. And so I gave them just a moment to think of a red ball. And then we went around the room and I said, okay, what does your red ball look like? What does your red ball look like? Without fail, every single red ball that those students had envisioned, it was different for every person. There were not the same two styles or ideas. For instance, somebody would say, I envisioned one of those small red hard plastic balls that you find in, like Chuck E. Cheese or wherever, that you go jumping into. Someone else said, I envisioned one of those red balls that you played kickball with out, during recess. And so the whole point, I would say, okay, great. We all came up with these different things. What we have to do as journalists, when we're describing something, let's say if we're describing a red ball, you have to describe it in a way that your listeners are going to see the same ball that you are looking at, or as close as they possibly can get to it. Our minds are going to envision a lot of different things based on our own personal experiences. But when you're writing journalism, you want to make sure that you're getting your audience as close to the objective reality as you possibly can.
I like where this is going because it is a reminder that communication is more than just us talking. Communication is more than just what we write or what we say. Communication is a two-way street. And it is a process of us saying things, yes, but our listeners hearing us and understanding us. And since we're talking to many people we might not even know, we have to write in a way that probably will make sense to them, but there's still a chance they will hear us in a way that we did not intend. And that uncertainty in communication leads to something very important.
Journalism is never 100% truth, and you can't really determine how the audience is going to take the information that you give them and what they're going to do with it or how they're going to think about it.
That doesn't sound right, does it? It caught me by surprise when I first heard it. After all, as news producers and news consumers, isn't truth the thing we're expecting to hear?
It's never 100% truthful objective. Journalism at its best tries to get to reality as it is. It'll never be 100%. It's just impossible. There's a book that I teach out of that I think that demonstrates this really, really well. It's called the World News Prism. And the idea is this, is that we see things through, like light goes through a prism. So let's say if you take the white light of objective reality, and maybe we're able to know this or maybe we're not, but if you take this white light and it goes through this prism of understanding, all of the different rainbow colors, those shades of colors that come through that prism can give us a good representation of how we understand that information. Maybe the top color is as close to objective truth and reality as we can get. Maybe the bottom color is absolute propaganda and lies. And the way we present information and interpret information falls somewhere along that spectrum right there, and if that makes sense. And so I think that's actually a good image for understanding how media shares information. It's going through these particular prisms of our culture and our own personal understanding and our own biases. And as professionals, we try to mitigate those as much as we can, but it's never 100% effective.
Now, actually, I get that. What you write may be 100% clear to you, but how will listeners hear those words? And then to add to the complexity of clear communication, it seems that journalists are expected to become experts in the stories they're covering, which is almost always an impossibility. There's usually not enough time for that.
That makes journalism difficult, right? Because it's our job to find out things and explain things.
And people do listen to journalists with an expectation that everything they report is right. So it's a problem when the reporter doesn't understand it enough. How many times have you read articles about podcasting where you realize that the writer of that article doesn't really understand the history of podcasting or maybe even how things are being done today? Or sometimes it could be that they do comprehend whatever story they're telling, but it could be that they don't know how to tell the story in a way that makes sense to the listener or the reader.
There's always going to be a need to break news and to explain, hey, here's what's going on today, or here's what's happening tomorrow, or what happened yesterday. But that is certainly not good enough anymore. And I think one of the things that journalism needs to do a better job of is explanation, even analysis of what these things mean, or explanations of these big concepts, that it's just not good enough to say, oh, country X is doing something and country Y objects, and here's the next news item. It's okay to say that, but then there needs to be follow-up with, hey, here's some history of this issue. Here's what's going on. Here's why this could be problematic. And that starts to get you into some of the areas where, am I reading a straight-up news report, or am I reading someone's expert opinion about this? And so we still need to be careful about that, like identifying what this type of information is and who's giving it to you. But I think explanation and analysis is going to be key that journalism needs to do a better job of from here on out.
Okay, I have never heard a journalist do what I'm about to suggest, but I wonder if it would be beneficial for them to sometimes say, I've researched this story as much as I could in the time allowed. I'm explaining what I know to the very best of my ability. But you know what? There's possibly, maybe probably, a lot of things that I still don't understand about this issue.
Yeah. In fact, I think that would be like podcasting, for instance. Let's talk about it from the standpoint of, you're a traditional legacy media outlet. Let's say, just since that's our background, let's say you're a public radio station and you do news and you cover local news, local state, whatever. That podcasting would be a great opportunity to follow up and say, at the end of the newscast, and hey, we'll be talking more about these issues on our podcast. You can download it by 2:00 today. And in that podcast, you're offering extra material. And you, as the reporter, are talking about how you went about trying to get this information and what you know and what you don't know. I think in today's era, this idea of transparency is I like it, by the way. I think it's great when you could actually engage with your audience more and say, hey, audience members, thanks for joining us. Let's talk a little bit about where we're coming from on this story. We're still trying to find this. These people haven't gotten back in touch with us, but we're working on that. I hate to call it bonus material, but you get the idea. And so that's a time where I think a podcast could be considered supplemental to what's going on. And I think the people who would tune into that in the first place are people who are keenly interested in what you are doing as a news organization or the stories that you're working on. And they want to understand why you are doing what you're doing and why you are covering the stories that you are covering. That gives us an opportunity that we don't have in the normal broadcast to explain those things and to talk about those things. And of course, that's just one particular way you could use podcasting. I think podcasting is fantastic as its own type of medium where you're doing your own reporting and your own type of stuff anyway. It doesn't have to be supplemental, but that's one way that you can use it, that legacy media, I think, do a really good job with it. I personally think it's great anytime I could interact with my audience in a better way and more often. I dig that kind of stuff. So I think that's one way that you could use it. And I think that helps you build a loyal, trusting audience. Even if it's on a controversial issue, you can explain, well, here's how we tried to do this and what we were trying to do, and give them an opportunity for feedback.
So podcasting can be that thing that pulls back the curtain, so to speak, and reveals more of this process of how journalists do what they do.
Yeah, I think it would go a long way toward reestablishing some credibility, too, because I think people make the mistake of thinking that journalists themselves are supposed to be objective. We're all humans. We can't possibly be completely objective on everything. I think the journalism process is what should be objective. Like, we've approached this story this way, and here's how we do things when we're trying to cover a story. But I think that would go a long ways in helping people rebuild some credibility. And I think this kind of comes in with the arguments as well. People say, oh, well, the mainstream media, I hate them, blah, blah, blah. I got to be honest. I'm really sick of those arguments. I'm really tired of those. Because as I've said it in a few places with some chats that I've done, the Constitution of the United States, the First Amendment, guarantees us a free press. It does not guarantee us a fair press. That's a totally different thing. And that's why you get all these people who can do whatever they want from all different kinds of perspectives. But I think if you wanted to go to this idea of mainstream media and people's distrust of it, I think a lot of it is just they just don't understand what we're doing and what the process is. And so when people are open about that, I think that can help.
Now, coming up, something that might be a bit controversial. What is journalism? And then we'll wrap things up with a few practical tips. Hey, so what do you think so far about doing a journalistic local podcast? I am curious to hear your opinion about it. Just go to podcastlocal.com and comment on the show notes or click contact for other ways to share your thoughts. But first, I want to thank the folks who make the Satchel Podcast Player. They've made a podcast player, a podcatcher, as some call it, that benefits your local podcast with a feature that helps you get discovered. Anyone using the Satchel Player can simply click Local to find podcasts about their community or podcasts on different topics being produced near their community. If you have a local podcast you'd like to be discovered, go register your show for free at satchelplayer.com. Hey, and try out the player while you're at it. Search for podcasts produced near you. It's all free for Android and iOS, satchelplayer.com. By the way, a lot of the advice offered in this episode applies whether you podcast journalistically or not. I remember receiving a different kind of advice back in the 90s when I was a DJ at a commercial radio station. I was told to sound confident whenever I turned on the mic. Even if I wasn't sure about something, I needed to sound like I was absolutely sure. I know that advice was given to help me, and yes, sometimes I can sound a bit hesitant when I'm not 100% certain about something. But can that advice apply all the time in a local podcast? For example, when you're doing initial research before interviewing someone, or you're finding out about that local historic site, or you're previewing upcoming events. Don't you want to make sure you have all the facts and that all the facts you have are accurate?
One of the things that I have always taught students who worked with me when I was working professionally or my students who are in my classrooms is I'll tell them, don't you ever write or say anything that you don't have a good understanding of or that you can't back it up, because why would you be telling your audience something that you really don't know or you're not sure of? And in case an audience member calls up and says, hey, yeah, I heard that. Can you explain that to me? If your response is, actually, no, I can't because I don't know what I'm talking about, that ruins your credibility instantly. So at the very least, if there are things that you don't understand and you can't figure it out and you can't get a good grip on it, the first thing I tell them is, hey, guess what? Don't put it in your story. You can come back to that later. If it's something that absolutely has to be in that story, well, the story's not going out yet until you get this, you get a good grip on this. But if it can hold off for a little while, take it out. We'll come back to it later. Don't put anything in there that you don't know what you're talking about. And so I'm like you. I think I can understand maybe the attitude of that guy saying like, hey, just sound confident in what you're talking about. But from the journalistic side of it, what I've always told people is don't you dare be talking about anything that you don't know what's up or you haven't done the research on it, because you don't want to get called out for passing something to your audience that you don't know. That's just cardinal sin. You can't do that. The other thing related to that, and I'll give you a phrase that I hate, and I know lots of people use it, and that's fine. I'm just telling you my own personal point of view, is this fake it till you make it idea. You hear that a lot. I see people who are on television news offer this advice to young people who are wanting to be on TV. Is like, hey, just fake it till you make it. My attitude is don't fake anything. It's okay to not be confident and to kind of figure that out. We've all got to figure out our jobs. But this idea of telling people in a news industry to fake something has never set well. And so what I tell students is don't fake it until you make it. You be prepared. You come in ready to go so that you don't have to fake anything. You're going to have to learn on the job. You're going to have to get better. That's the whole point of experience. You can't get experience until you do these things. But don't try to fake something. You be ready to go. And you're not always going to be 100% prepared, but you be prepared as much as you can, and then you don't have to fake anything. So I even tell my students, like, please don't utter that phrase around me, or don't tell other people that as well. It's unnecessary. I just don't like the idea that promotes. And that's just my own personal quirk. I just can't stand it.
Okay, so if you're ready to turn your local podcast into a journalism podcast, where do you start? Of course, you might not want the whole thing to be focused on news. Maybe just an episode here or there. Or you could even consider starting small and just include one journalistic type story as a segment within one episode. Well, regardless of ever how you want to do it, what should you do first?
I'll say if they've never had a journalism class or any kind of thing like that, I think the first thing you want to do is have an understanding of what journalism is and what is the point and what are the industry's accepted ethical standards. And I think this can get a little tricky because there's some big name journalism type folks who make the argument that if you do an act of journalism, then you are a journalist. And they'll say an act of journalism would be interviewing someone and putting it up online. I disagree with that. If I put a splint on your broken leg, I have engaged in an act of medical care. That does not make me a physician. If you're going to claim to be a journalist and doing journalistic work, then I'm expecting you to follow a process. I'm expecting you to adhere to certain standards and professional values. And if you're not, then I'm not considering what you're doing journalism. You might be collecting interviews and putting stuff together and putting it out for the masses, but you haven't demonstrated to me that you are doing it in a journalistic way. And I hope that makes sense. So the first thing I would say is if you're wanting to do this type of stuff, if you're wanting to do journalism, you better understand what journalism is. Read a book, talk to a journalist, go to the SPJ, Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, which is considered a standard in the industry. Go to the RTDNA, Radio, Television, Digital News Association. See what their codes of ethics are. Look at other codes of ethics for photojournalism, things like that. So if you're going to be doing journalism, then do journalism and adhere to those standards.
So this kind of surprised me. Like I said, I remember Butler Kane as an easygoing guy who was not adamant about his personal views, or at least he just kept them to himself. He didn't come across as someone who was ready to argue with you. But I got to say, this is a very strong perspective on what is and is not journalism.
Yeah, I do feel very strongly about that because I feel like more so than ever, journalism's borders have been attacked and they're changing, and we have a lot more access now to people just putting out whatever they want. And I don't want people to make a mistake if they see somebody blogging about something or that somebody's tweeting about something and thinking, oh, well, this is journalism too. Sometimes I might say, oh, yeah, it is. Other times I might say, no, clearly this is not. And here's why. And so I want to be very protective of journalism and the people who engage in journalism and perform journalism because I believe journalism is important. I believe it's important to democracy. I believe it's important to society. And I believe it's important to having an informed citizenry. And it irritates me when I see people trading on this idea of what journalism is and what they're peddling is not journalism. And also on people presuming that what they're seeing is journalism and they're ignorant of what journalism should be at its core. And so then they're just putting it all in one big pile and they don't trust any of it. And I think some of this is on journalists to do a better job, but some of this is on society as well. I think the public has some responsibility here to know what is good information, what is good journalism, to know and understand the people who are going through the correct process to get you good information versus those who are not. The public has some responsibility here as well. And so I get caught up a little bit on some of that stuff because I think journalists need to do a better job, but the public needs to do a better job as well.
You know, in some ways, a local journalism podcast sounds daunting. I mean, it's one thing to record conversations with local people, but going journalistic sounds like you are taking things to a new level of responsibility. But let's say, okay, you really do want to pursue this. So you go out, you cover a story, you write about it, you record it, you listen to it, and you don't like what you hear.
No one says the first go at it has to ever see the light of day. You might do 5 shows as practice before you ever put one out. So it might actually be the 6th show that is technically your first, to go out to the masses. And so I think that's something that folks don't think about a lot is to jump in and start making your errors, and maybe show 3 is when you figure out, oh, I really need to do this technically. That works a lot better. And so there's nothing saying that you can't start this stuff and then perfect your craft and then start putting it out for public consumption. Professionals do this all the time. Nobody's ever watched a movie or seen an advertisement that hasn't been, vetted or let some other people listen in or take a look at before it goes out to the masses. So I think that could be a good lesson there too. Just dive right in. You don't have to put the first thing out to everybody to hear. It may not be worthy of that, and that's fine.
Okay, so summarizing what we have learned so far, first of all, get an understanding of what journalism is. Read a book like Sound Reporting, which I'll tell you more about in a moment, and look through various codes of ethics related to journalism and audio reporting. Now, ready to do this thing. What next?
Once you get to that point and you're wanting to go out and talk to people, it's really that simple. Decide what story you want to cover. Decide, why is it an important story? Why do you think it needs to be heard? Why do you want to invest your time and effort interviewing people related to this topic? Because you're going to be spending time doing it. You want to do something that's worthwhile. So find a topic that you think is worthwhile of your time and energy and effort, and then come up with the ideas that you want to explore with that topic and write questions related to that. Find people who have expertise in that. Don't necessarily just go find somebody who can offer you opinion on something. Find people who can offer you an informed opinion, people who have expertise. Because when it comes down to it, remember this, you're doing this for an audience. You're wanting people to hear what you are putting together. So have enough respect for your audience to find people who have something valuable to say on whatever topic it is that you're wanting to discuss or to tackle. Otherwise, you're going to be wasting your audience's time. You're going to be wasting your interviewee's time. And ultimately, you're going to be wasting your time. So invest a lot of time in the topic, the angles, the perspectives that you want to discuss on that topic. It's always a great idea to balance differing opinions. I know we talk a lot about there's always 2 sides. That's not true. There are multiple sides. It's never a black and white. There are many, many more than just 2 sides. So feel free to try to tackle 2, 3, 4 different perspectives on that kind of thing. Focus and concentrate on the basic things. Keep your audience in mind, inform them, make this as a public service, something that the public would be interested in and can learn from. And in the end, you want to put something together that you are proud of and that you're proud to put before the public.
That's Butler Kane with an introduction to journalism for local podcasters. Follow Butler on Twitter at Butler Kane. His last name, by the way, is spelled C-A-I-N. So this book I recommend is called Sound Reporting, the NPR Guide to Audio Journalism and Production. It's written by Jonathan Kern. This book covers in greater detail much of what Butler Kane talked about in this episode. And it also gives advice and insight for writing to be heard instead of writing to be read. There are chapters on editing, both kinds of editing, not just editing with Audacity or Audition, but the earlier, pre-production editing that is done when your story is in the writing stage. In fact, the better you get at editing while writing, the easier it will be when it comes to post-production. There are 18 chapters in this book that will help you become a better local journalist, but it will also be helpful no matter what kind of local podcast you choose to do. Oh, and one more resource that's available for free online, NPR's editorial training site. It's actually made for people who work at NPR member stations, but it's open to the general public. And I guarantee you will find some actionable advice on that site. You might even find something there today that helps you improve the very next episode of your local show. The best page to start with is their Learn the Basics page. Or you can explore the other articles on audio, digital, social, and visual. It's all at training.npr.org. Also, check out those codes of ethics. Seriously, good stuff there. In fact, I think the codes of ethics themselves could be worth an entire episode. I'll link to the 2 that Butler Kane mentioned as well as another one that I found. Go to podcastlocal.com to find the show notes and links to all of that. And while you're there, please tell me what you thought about this episode. Leave a comment and let me know if this has been helpful. Also, let me know if you agree or take issue with anything Butler Kane talked about in this episode. I'm Jason Norris. Thanks for listening to episode 12 of Podcast Local from On The Go FM.